Okay, let's move on to the next topic, right? This next module. Again, this is a very, very important topic. Well, at least to my opinion, lah. Okay, because a lot of mistakes and errors, I would say, right, when it comes to recording or when it comes to handling any sort of audio, be it in an analog realm or even in digital, right, boils down to not understanding, right, how to look and read at meters and not understanding what operating levels are. Let's take a quick look and let's dive into this subject. Okay. In previous weeks where I talked about some of the properties of sound and digital audio, dynamic range, right? The actual definition of what a dynamic range is, right, is the difference, is the spread between the highest and the lowest signal levels, right? That the device, that the system can accommodate. So every time you buy a piece of equipment or interface or something like that, right, you always have these specifications. You see what, oh, the converter dynamic range 127 dB, 119 dB, or so on and so forth, 113 dB. So this is the spread, is the range between the maximum and the minimum, right, level of frequencies that it can convert and you can work with. The second the term, right, concept you very important to also know is called headroom. Headroom, very, very simple, right? If you have Joey or someone, or or Colin, right? Colin, because Colin is very tall, right? If he stands, okay, how much space is there between his head and before he, all right, hits the ceiling, right? So that is what we call the headroom. So if Colin, let's say, stands next to Joey, so Joey, right, since Colin is so tall and Joey is a little smaller size, okay, so Joey would have a lot more headroom, okay? She can jump around a lot more before hitting the head on the ceiling. Colin, I think, probably take one jump, you probably, punch a hole to the ceiling already, okay? Right. So you can take that as your analogy, how much, safety margin you have before you hit your head on the ceiling. So definition, okay, is the region between your normal, right? So your normal, or what we call nominal operating level. So every device or every system will have kind of a nominal operating level, and it also has your peak. In this case, right, the ceiling, the roof, above which, of course, as I mentioned earlier, in digital audio, what you will get your clipping, you will get your distortion, right? So your headroom is the margin that you have before you, right, hit into clipping or distortion. Okay, now what's the next term that's very important to know? Signal to noise ratio. Okay, so once again, anytime you buy a device, right, pay attention, look at all the specs. They do, give you an idea, an indication of how well a device performs, right? So signal to noise ratio would be the range between your nominal operating level, okay, remember, your normal operating level, and the noise floor, okay? So this is kind of the opposite of headroom, right? Headroom is until the ceiling, right? It's here, signal to noise ratio is your noise floor. Now, every device that's any kind of electric or electronic device will always have some form of noise floor one, right? So obviously a higher quality device, something that has much better components, right, will of course, right, have less noise, lower noise. Anything from a microphone to a preamp to any kind of effect, okay, will always have some sort of noise floor in it. Okay, so here, right, this is the kind of a diagram to sort of explain and describe to you, right, all these kind of different terms. First one was dynamic range, right? So dynamic range is from your lowest level, which is your noise floor, until your maximum operating level, where you above that you get clipping, you get distortion. So dynamic range is from your floor to your ceiling, okay, your analogy. Your nominal operating level would be your, what we call maybe your normal level, okay? So where if you are standing, okay, that's your normal level, the level of where your head is. So you have your headroom, which is above your head, the margin before you get to clipping, and you have your signal to noise ratio. So this is right how you determine and you sort of identify. And whenever you look into, again, the next time you buy a product or you look at a product online, all these specifications there are published, right? Because it gives you a measure of how the device performs. Okay. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Let's talk about meters next. All right, so now we understand your dynamic range, we understand your headroom, we understand signals not to noise ratio. We want to also understand meters, right, and where we encounter them. So there are several types of meters, right? What we want to know and to be aware of would be firstly the VU meter, right? So VU here is short for volume units. VU meter is very useful because it correlates with the human hearing. It correlates with our perception of how the ear's judgment of loudness. So full deflection, okay, full deflection mean if you have a VU meter and it fully deflects all the way, is about 0.33 seconds lah, which is a little bit slow. It's not super fast. So typical VU meter is this one, okay. Now, obviously you can also download plugins lah, right, of a VU meter, because most of the meters inside a DW are of a peak, right, peak design, but you can also, download some free VU meter plugins as well. So the next one, okay, as I mentioned, is your peak meter. Now the full name actually is called peak program meter lah, PPM. So PPM here is an electronic device that can detect peak levels. So it's very fast, right? And it needs to be fast because you need to detect peaks, because the peaks are the ones that will sort of distort or give you distortion or cause clipping. So the full deflection is very fast, 10 milliseconds only, right? But the fallback time, right, for the time for the meter to fall back, right, or fall back down is slow. It's 3 seconds. And you know the reason why to do that? Because if your fallback time is also very fast, then the peak is like, you cannot see, right? So that's why you have a very fast deflection and a fairly slow fallback time. So you can see, oh, okay, the peak is there, right? Otherwise, you'll be like, it's just there and then it's gone. You don't even notice it. So this would be a kind of a typical kind of a peak program meter, right? There are also combinations lah, all right? Okay, next one. So there are other types of peak meters, okay? Sample accurate, sample counting, reconstruction meters, stereo meters. You have bit meters. You have your oscilloscope displays, which I showed you, in the previous week. Very very common now in a lot of softwares would be your combination of different meters lah. So, for example, this is taken from Wavelab, right? You can see the several segments, several bars. The one that's at the top and the bottom, the outer ones, those are your peak, and the one that's the inner, those are your VU meters, right? It's corresponding to that. So inside a digital, right, they will sometimes combine it in this kind of view and this kind of interface. So it's important to identify, are you looking at a peak or are you looking at a VU? Even panning also can have a meter as well, right? This is what we call pan meters. Couple of very important things. I'll go very quickly, right? Don't spend too much time on it, right? So you got to know, firstly, obviously, what's your peak value lah, because that's important. Your peak value determines how much headroom given, right? How much safety margin before you clip or distort a signal. Then you have your average, and very often we refer to, right, signals, we call it RMS, root mean square. Again, back to your maths lessons back in the high school again. Okay, so your peak obviously will be from your to the peak. Average is average. RMS is actually close to average. They're kind of, you can measure them the same way, but the mathematical formula behind RMS is a little bit different lah. Very quickly, let's talk about decibel. Okay, the dB. So this is actually a very complex topic. It's very long, so I try to condense it, right, into as simple as basic as possible, because a lot of people get confused. So one thing you must understand about dB, right? dB is actually a relative quantity. It's not like cm, centimeter, kilometer, where it's absolute. So when something is absolute means you can absolutely measure it from point A to point B and it gives you that. dB is different. dB always needs to have a reference. You always need to compare with something. Decibels are actually a ratio. Couple of dBs that you want to understand, all right, to know, right? The first one would be the dBSPL. Okay, I covered that last week, all right? We're talking about properties of sound. dBSPL, it's a measure of sound pressure level in the atmosphere. So next one, dBu. Okay, right? So this again just for your general knowledge lah. dBu here means decibels unterminated. So this is compared to a reference voltage of 0.775 volts. Again, these are all the definitions. Don't have to memorize that, okay? So dBm, right? dBm here is decibels compared to a power reference of 1 milliwatt. Then you have DBFS, decibels compared to digital full scale. The FS here meaning full scale, okay? In digital, as I explained before, 0 dBFS represents the highest digital level. You cannot exceed in digital, you cannot exceed 0 dBFS, right? So you exceed that, it's distortion, it's clipping already. So you see, dB always needs to reference to something on. You just saying dB alone is meaningless. So I mean, usually, of course, right, in our day-to-day conversation, we just use dB lah. But you always have to bear in mind that it always means that it's reference to something. When we say, oh, the speaker, wow, the speaker can give 100 dB, man. We are actually referencing to dBSPL because that's the sound pressure level or that the speaker can generate. We are not referring to dBu or dBm or dBFS because we're referring to that. There's always some kind of reference. And when we are inside digital, when we're inside a DAW, all right, when we say, oh, the signal level, right, is we are getting this signal level at minus 18, right? It's dBFS because we're talking about a digital scale. Right, moving on. We clear? I don't want to super confuse, right? Because dB, right, a lot of people, when they dive into the topic, they'll be like, oh, it's so confusing, man, because there's dB this, dB that, dB here and there, dB ABCD, all everything. Okay, so important ones, I think for most of our applications that we want to know would be your dBSPL and dBFS lah. If you're working inside a DAW environment, gain staging, and this is a very prickly topic. Okay, because there are some people who argue and say that it doesn't matter. Some people who say that it's not important. All right. I know a lot of professionals will argue for gain staging lah and say that it is actually very important. Now, here's one thing, okay? There are differences. The one thing that very important, right, is that there's a difference in analog and digital audio gain staging due to again, we are using different references. When we are measuring, let's say, an analog signal, right, it's usually dBu, okay? But when it goes into a digital RAM, we are measuring it using the dBFS. It's a different scale. We must not be confused, you see, because when you talk about dBu, you see on a mixer, an analog mixer, the zero is not on top. It's like somewhere, it's like maybe 3/4 of the way up. You can always go above. You can go up to +5 dBu, +10, maybe, right, up to +10. But in digital, there's no such thing as a +2, +3 dBFS lah, right? Maximum is 0, right? So dBFS values are always all negative. Okay, now, so this diagram, right, when I give you the slides, right, the notes which you can take back, keep this and remember this. This is sort of how you compare and you calibrate and look at a dBFS scale and a dBu scale. Right, so dBFS is used as in a digital system. dBu is in an analog system. There's a definition, SMPTE RP 155 standard. First of all, let's take a look at the digital system at the left, right? So you can see digital clipping is always at 0, okay? That's the limit already, 0, okay? You cannot go above. So you have nominal peak levels, -12, and very important thing here, SMPTE alignment level, okay? SMT here stands for Society of Motion Pictures and Television Engineers. Okay, so they have determined, right, the alignment level, all right, is minus 20 dBFS. I'll show you again later on when we get in there. Now, and a typical 24-bit converter noise floor is about minus 119 dBFS lah. It's around that, right? So it's minus 119 dB. So that is looking at the digital system. Clear? Right? I know it's a lot to digest and it can be very confusing, okay? But later on, there'll just be a few very important takeaways, that's all. So that's on the digital side. Let's look at the analog side now, right? So let's look, very important here. Let's look at nominal operating level for an analog system is plus 4 dBu, okay? So very often when you see maybe some devices, right, you on the outputs, they will say that, oh, this output is plus 4 dBu, right? Right, or sometimes they have a minus 10 dBV or something like that. You have some devices you can switch the output level because minus 10 dBV is for consumer, plus 4 dBu is the professional level. Kind of pay attention to that, right? Every time even on your audio interface, your outputs, right, they usually mention one, whether it's plus 4 dBu or minus 10 dBV lah. So because that is very important, that's actually your nominal operating level, plus 4. And the equivalent here in this case is minus 20 dB, right? DBFS, again, I mustn't forget. Okay, I must always mention the FS because otherwise it's meaningless. Okay, so plus 4 dBu, right, is equal to minus 20 dBFS. It's calibrated, right? Alignment level is aligned and calibrated that way. Now, analog system, typical professional analog console, the clipping point would be plus 24. Some of them have even higher, okay? Right? There's no technical limit here because it all depends on the circuitry, depends on the component, how well designed it is, how much headroom it has. You know, if the device is well designed, running on a very high rail voltage or something like that, then wow, it can have a million dB of headroom for all that matter, okay? Depending on how well designed and how well it is. So do you see the difference between the two? You guys see the difference, right? So the important thing to remember is the minus 20. Okay, and obviously you can also have your noise floor. In an analog device, your noise floor is usually a little bit louder, right? Because analog devices are of course noisier than a digital device. Okay, now, so this alignment level, this is very important. So the two things you want to remember will be this alignment level. For digital audio, as a reference to analog systems, is around minus 18 to minus 20 dBFS. Why minus 18? Because again, it depends on what organization or what standards you refer to. So as I mentioned, SMT here uses minus 20. ASEBU, I think, uses slightly different. BBC will use a different broadcasting organization will probably use a different one. But the important to know, it's around that. It's between minus 18 to minus 20 dBFS. Going back to, let's say, an analog device, okay? So when we try to set the level on the preamp gain on an analog mixer, we always try to measure and try to, set your gain on the preamp so that on the mixer we look at the meter, right? So those of you who know how to, right, will know right? That's how we try to target that. But bear in mind, what meter are we talking about? What scale are we talking about? We're talking about the dBu scale. A lot, especially in the early days of digital, a lot of people were confused because they forget. Some people, even to this day, they still forget about these two, right? The alignment levels are different. So actually, whatever level that is already optimal on an analog device, you are getting 0 on the analog. Okay, that's a good level already. When you put it inside a digital system, you feed it into a digital system, it's actually around minus 20, minus 18, minus 20. So the early days of digital, the rule of thumb that everyone was being taught was like, oh, okay, we try to record as hot as possible, right? Without clipping. And actually, there is a reason why, lah. Especially in the early days, the resolution of most digital converters only go up to 16-bit. So there is a reason why, because if you record too too low, there tends to be too much noise, right? The noise level, the noise floor. Remember, there is always noise floor. Even though digital, they say claim, oh, it's silent, there's no noise. There's always some noise floor inside any kind of system. So you guys are kind of keeping with me, yeah? This is kind of very complicated thing to sort of wrap your head around, lah. So what happens in the digital RAM, especially in the early days? They were recording as hot as possible without clipping. But now come the advent of now we have 24-bit resolution audio already. So again, no reason for you to be recording in 16-bit. So always check your settings, your bit depth, right? Make sure you're recording in 24-bit lah, right? or higher. So when we are actually recording digitally and then you're looking at your input meters, this is kind of where you want to aim for. Inside digital, you are aiming for -18 to -20. Back to even the first week when I was showing you, right? I was recording drums. Look, you can always see what was the level I was aiming for. I was kind of aiming for about -18 average. Maybe some of the peaks will peak at -12. This is where, again, right, the old early days of digital, that advice really does not hold true anymore. So this is what you should do nowadays. Record, all right, at conservative levels. There's no reason for you to turn the gain really way up nowadays with 24-bit converters, digital audio resolution nowadays. You can always record at conservative levels, and you are already, because of the reference level between analog and digital systems, you're already getting a very good level of signal already. What happens is that in digital, inside DAW, sometimes the waveform will look very small. Right? So some people they say, "Ayo, the waveform so small. Something wrong. Is my level not high enough?" Again, if you're aware of how the alignment is, it's actually fine. It's actually perfectly fine. Your waveform is small, you can always zoom in, and so you can see your waveform looks a bit bigger, lah. It doesn't mean your waveform needs to fill up the thing, then only is good, right? Because you are recording hotter than is necessary, right? Again, there's nothing wrong. You can always record hot if you prefer, right? But again, digital converters, it's not like you're running through a tube preamp or something like that, right? Once you distort, it distorts. Okay, it doesn't saturate like a tube preamp or a transformer or an analog device, lah, right? So going through all that, right? All you need to remember is just record at lower levels, lah, right? Don't need to, if there's all the information that I churned out for you earlier just now, there's so much technical stuff and technical details. Just remember, just be conservative. You don't clip it. As long as you don't clip it, keep it low, -18, -20. That's perfectly fine. This should probably be the last thing. Earlier, you heard me talking about, mic level, instrument level, line level, okay, speaker level. So these are what we call operating levels. We understand earlier on, right, that in analog, we talk about a nominal operating level is about 0 dB, right? It's about 0 dBu lah. Digital, that's about -20. Okay, let's look at the system. Let's going from microphone to a console. Let's going to a power amp. That's going to a speaker. Let's say this is a typical PA system lah. Okay, you have first of all, your mic level. So the level of the signal, the current that's coming out from microphone is very low. It's actually very, very low. It can range from everything from -70 dBu to around, if a condenser that has, -70, maybe like a ribbon mic or dynamic, okay? All right. So because the output is a bit low. And -10 dBu sometimes if like, it's a very, very hot kind of maybe a tube condenser or something that has got a high output. Sometimes it can be up to -10 dBu. So those are microphone levels, okay? So just imagine lah, right? Based on the meter, mic levels are at that level. Okay, next one, right? Similar around the same range would be your instrument level. So instrument level here in this case, your guitar outputs, right? From your pickups, guitar, bass, keyboards, synths, right? would be outputting usually what we call instrument levels. So instrument levels are also fairly low. You have minus 30 dBu, and some of them that gets a little bit hotter, maybe active pickups, right? So active pickups will sometimes deliver a much hotter level as well, about minus, sometimes up to minus 3. Again, these are rough figures lah, okay? These are not absolutely, it's within this range. Sometimes could be more, could be less. This is just for reference. Okay, so now line level, right? So professional line level is defined as plus 4 dBu, right? As I mentioned earlier, you can always refer back to the earlier diagram, right? Line level is that plus 4 dBu. Consumer now, depending on what sort of device lah, consumer levels are a little bit lower, right, in terms of level, and it's referenced as minus 10 dBV. Okay, so again, it's slightly different, but basically it's a lower level lah, right? So for consumer equipment. Now, next one, right? Going into from an amplifier into a speaker. So this is speaker level, all right? So speaker level is plus 30 dBu and above and beyond to infinity, okay? Looking at all these operating levels, mic, line level, speaker level, this is where it's important. Why is it important to know, right? All these kind of operating levels. It's important simply because you don't want to blow anything up. Basically that, right? You do not want to be feeding, let's say, right, a line level signal into something that's meant to take an instrument level input, let's say an amplifier, right? You don't want to do that, okay? Because you can potentially fry it. I've done it before. I have done it accidentally before, right? A long time ago, I used to use the Line 6 pot, right? All right. So it's the old now the Line 6 Helix and all that lah. It's more, we have your Campers, you have your XFX and all that. So those can actually deliver line level. So I had actually one time lah, pandai, right? All right. I took the pot, right, and then plug it into the effects return, right, of a amplifier, of a amp, guitar amp, right? For nicely turn the level up. I normally know that I can feed a line level, but somehow maybe on that one occasion I totally forgot about it. So I go and turn it up like almost maximum. Play. Suddenly, like after 10, 15 minutes, right? You can smell something burning. Literally, the amp input, the input was fried, right? Because that was, I was sending a line level into something that can only, handle instrument level. Okay, so it's very, very important to know that. Similarly, okay, you cannot take the output from an amplifier, from a power amp. You don't take that and feed that into a mixer, for example. Oh no, that is going to be very, very bad news. Okay, very, very bad news for your device lah, for your mixer lah. Again, smoke will get into your eyes. Okay, so it's important to always know the operating levels, right? In the kind of the easiest scenario, you cannot get signal or you cannot get sound, right? So for example, if you are just trying to plug you're trying to get a, let's say, instrument level thing, plug into a passive speaker. You're obviously not going to get sound because the passive speaker does not have, you're not sending enough level to that speaker to drive it. You need a power amp. So at the worst, you cannot get sound, or the sound is very soft, level very soft. Worst case scenario, the other way, you fry, you burn, and something will catch fire, okay? So that's why it's important to know these operating levels. So that brings us to the end of this week's topics. So very important, right? Know your metering, know how to read your meters, okay? Know and be aware that in digital, your metering and your alignment and your reference level is different. We're talking about minus 18 to about minus 20 dBFS. And in analog is different. So be aware of the two differences. And why you need to be aware of these two differences? Because again, you don't want to fry anything. You don't want to, be clipping. You don't want to be distorting anything, right? And that also applies for, right? Operating levels, your mic level, your instrument level, line level, and your speaker level. Okay, so cool. Right, so we're gonna move into our recording session after this, right? So let's head on into the control room. We'll see you back, all right, in a couple of seconds.